trustworthy ally in the war on terrorism, the so-called war on terrorism, in the case of Afghanistan, even towards Iran in the beginning. Internally, he cracked down on the robber capitalism of the Yeltsin years. Was that just window dressing?
I think what one could say is that he was doing, at the beginning, good things for a bad reason. And in a way, Yeltsin was doing bad things for a good reason. Yeltsin was trying to make Russia into a free, law-governed state, but did it in ways that didn't really work. And Putin did some things that did work, but he was doing as part of this, what I call the creeping putsch of re-establishing FSB control everywhere. Now, he was quite right to do something about the regions. Russia had gone for a kind of wild decentralization, which was threatening the internal market. You were getting restrictions on the movement of goods between regions, and some of the governors were really little more than robber barons, and it was right to try and bring them in step. Equally, the tycoons had behaved atrociously during the Yeltsin era. There's no doubt about it. They'd stolen billions and billions of dollars and were turning wealth into power and power back into wealth again, and the state had to do something about that. What bothers me is it was so selective. This was not a crackdown on governors because they were corrupt or because they were lawless, but because they were disobedient on political things that the Kremlin wanted. Perhaps even more importantly, on the tycoons. He didn't go after Abramovich, who was the family banker for the Yeltsin family.
And the owner of Chelsea.
And the owner of Chelsea. He didn't go after Potanin. He didn't go after the ones who towed the Friedman. He didn't go after the oligarchs who towed the line. He went particularly after Gusinski, who owned the media, and after Berezovsky, who maybe knew some secrets, and he went after Khodorkovsky because he was trying to make Yukos untouchable by merging it with Exxon, a Western oil company.
And had political ambitions.
He had political ambitions too, and I think Khodorkovsky was, in retrospect, almost insanely self-confident. He simply didn't believe that any of this could affect him because he was used to being untouchable. But the means used discredited the whole idea of the rule of law in Russia, these fake bankruptcy proceedings, these fake claims of tax evasion. The whole way the legal system was used against Khodorkovsky was reminiscent almost of the Stalinist show trials of the 1930s. It was absolutely outrageous. And it was also clear that the authorities were not really bothered by what Khodorkovsky was alleged to have done, but what he had done in terms of political of politics. And this left a very bad impression. It showed that the rule of law didn't really matter. Politics was everything. And in a way, we don't have the rule of law, we have the law of rulers in Russia. And this is rather an important difference.
Yeah. Now, you describe the mentality of the people in power now in Russia and the way they look at the world as a kind of what you could say, a lager mentality, as they call it in South Africa. They have rounded up the wagons because they feel that the West is closing in on them. You cite in your book the limits that Russian ideologists put for Western influence in their hemisphere in 1992. And I quote, they said that the limit was neutrality of Eastern European countries, free entry to the Baltic ports, no anti-Russian buffer formed by GOS countries. It reads as the mirror image of what has happened. So isn't there some justification for Russia to feel threatened?
No, because ultimately the West is not trying to threaten Russia. We are trying to integrate. We have been trying for the last 20 years to integrate Russia into our system. And what this worldview, this Czechist, old-fashioned Soviet worldview, never understands is that security is not a zero-sum game. If you're more secure, that can also mean that I'm more secure. It's just like trade. If we trade with each other, we can both get richer. And they are still trapped in this zero-sum thinking of the Soviet system, which means that if they think if Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, if they're more secure, that means Russia is less secure. It doesn't. The expansion of NATO has actually made the whole of Eastern Europe safer because it's reduced the chance, for example, of a mad nationalist politician doing something silly. Security creates constraints on the members of an alliance. And so we don't have a security grey zone in the Baltic states, and this is good. And if you need a counterexample, look at Moldova. which is not in NATO and is still in a great mess as a result. So it's never been clear to me why Russia feels threatened by having stable democracies on its borders.
And do you think that they are not genuinely afraid of this Western enclosure, that it's just a trick to...
It's a good way of persuading the Russian people that the sacrifice of freedom is necessary. And one of the great themes of Chekist propaganda is that Russia is a besieged fortress. You know, Mother Russia surrounded by these enemies who will do anything to humiliate and weaken her. So therefore, let's not have any division, let's not have any argument. Everybody please do as they're told. Our country is under threat. And that's a very potent message, particularly for Russians who remember the 1990s as a time of chaos and humiliation. So stability and national security are strong themes, and they work. Now, when I'm being optimistic, I think these Chekists are just using this cynically, that all they really want to do is steal tens of billions of dollars, and this propaganda is a useful way of persuading the population to go along with it. When I'm feeling pessimistic, I think they really believe it.
How does all this lead, as you say in your book, to a new Cold War?
Well, as I said at the beginning, there's three different things. There's what's happening in Russia, where we see a nasty trajectory towards more and more authoritarianism. Now, Medvedev talks about freedom, and he gives some hints he may want to reverse that, but certainly the overwhelming institutional pressure is towards more repression, and that affects our friends in Russia. You know, I knew Anna Politkovskaya. She's dead now. You know, that is that kind of really sinister growth of repression is bad. At the moment, I would say it's sort of 80%, and that's probably quite stable. I doubt that all the Chekists wanted to go to 100%, because they know that 100% control is much more brittle, and it didn't work in Soviet times, so maybe they'll stop there. But I'm still worried about what's happening in Russia. I'm really worried about what's happening in Eastern Europe, because there's this
And especially in the Baltic states. Why the Baltic states?
No, not just, well, the Baltics, but also in the Caucasus and the Balkans and Central Europe. There's a tide of Russian money flooding through these countries, which have very young institutions, not fully grown in a way one could say after 1989. They needed another 10 years to get new, good politicians in, really entrench the rule of law, independent public institutions, all the things you need. And we're seeing you can buy politicians, you can buy political parties, you can even buy countries. Montenegro, for example, has basically been bought by Russia.
How does that work?
Well, because the Russians have billions and billions and billions of dollars.
But what are they buying?
In Montenegro, I mean, the Deripaska owns the aluminium plant that produces, I think, 40% of Montenegrin GDP just on its own. And then on top of that, there's huge Russian investment in real estate. And of course, when you have an overwhelming preponderance of Russian investment, then politics goes with it. Bulgaria, Russia owns the main oil refinery, which is the main taxpayer to the budget. In Lithuania, we saw Russian-backed politicians who were publicly exposed and disgraced, being pushed out of office with a pretty lot of effort from the West, but they were pushed out of office. One of them went into exile in Russia, came back, and has managed to go back into politics again. So we are, if you like, the immune system is not highly developed to deal with these people, and these are still basically poor countries. And then we also see it in the West as well. I wouldn't be too complacent about that. If I'd sat in your studio 6 years ago and said that a German chancellor, while he was still in office, would sign off on a gas deal with Russia that was so threatening that the Poles would call it the equivalent of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and then after leaving office would then take a lucrative job as the head of the consortium building that pipeline, you'd have thought I was mad, and that's pretty much exactly what Gerhard Schröder did.
So what are you implying? Is Mr. Schröder bought?
I think it would be libelous to say that, but certainly it's given rise to very sharp speculation about a conflict of interest. And we need to be a bit alarmed about this. Or in America, Kurt Weldon, a Republican congressman, one of the great experts in the House of Representatives on Russia, turned out to be taking large amounts of money from Itera, which was a highly dubious Russian company which existed to buy gas cheap and sell it expensively and siphon off the profits away from the shareholders to whom it would have naturally belonged, and he was disgraced and had to step down. But you can look all in every Western country, you can see Russian money at work. Now, I'm all in favour of trade with Russia and investment, and that's great, and we should be trying to integrate Russia into the world economy as much as we can. But when it comes with these political strings attached, they're worrying. So one of my points about the new Cold War is that it's banks, not tanks, we have to worry about. And we are wide open to this, because if we think that only money matters, then we're defenceless when people attack us using money.
Yeah. As you say, the Eastern European countries, the former influence sphere of the Soviet Union, they are most vulnerable for this development because their integration in the European Union is hampering. Why is it hampering? And what should the European Union do about that?
Well, one big thing is that they get most of their gas, or sometimes all of their gas, from Russia, and that makes them very vulnerable. And the European Union's been trying to build the Nabucco pipeline, which would bring gas from Central Asia and the Caspian up through Turkey and the Balkans into Central Europe. Now, it wouldn't carry a huge amount of gas, but it would be very important because it would break Gazprom's monopoly on east-west gas shipments, and that's very important, as that monopoly in a way is the fulcrum of the Kremlin's political power. And the Russians have been amazingly successful in blocking Nabucco. They've been nice to Turkey at a time when the EU's been nasty to Turkey, so the Turks are much keener to help the Russians than they are to help us. They've also gone to Bulgaria and to Serbia and offered them a good deal on the alternative Russian pipeline, South Stream, which goes across the Black Sea, and takes more Russian gas to Europe and entrenches the monopoly. So the Bulgarians and Serbs signed up for that. And then they very cleverly got the Austrians and the Hungarians, which were both at the beginning in favour of Nabucco, now to be against Nabucco and in favour of South Stream. They created a clever competition between the Austrians and the Hungarians about who was going to benefit the most from Russian gas. And
is that a money game too? I mean,
it's
Austria?
I remember the Cold War, and I remember the interesting games that Austria used to play during the Cold War. And although rather like Finland, they were nominally a Western capitalist democratic country, but they also seemed to have very good ties with the Soviets. And I think some of those haven't gone yet, or perhaps never went away. But I don't want to be particularly unfair on the Austrians, because other countries are just as bad. And although Europe is much bigger, stronger, freer, more attractive than Russia, the Gazprom tail wags the European dog all the time. It's extraordinary that we should be saying to the Russians, you really need us to buy your gas, and if you don't do what we want, you've got a problem. Instead of which, the Russians go to each individual European country and say, you really need our gas, do what we want, or you've got a problem. And so we see this ridiculous thing of the EU trying to liberalise the European energy market, quite rightly, increase interconnection, break up vertical monopolies, do all these things that are highly necessary. And Germany says no, because German energy companies don't like it, and German energy companies don't like it because Gazprom doesn't like it. And Gazprom is the gas division of Kremlin Inc. So in fact, you have a Kremlin veto in the heart of European policymaking.
Yeah. And you mentioned Mr. Schröder, who is now a chief executive of this Nord Stream pipeline that the Russians want to build to go around Poland. Why is that pipeline so dangerous? Because you say it even already has its effects on European politics without being in operation.
I doubt it's ever going to be built, actually. I mean, I think it's a tremendously useful symbolic thing for the Kremlin, because it showed that when push comes to shove, Germany does what Russia wants, not what its nominal East European allies want. The right thing for Germany to do would have been to say, okay, if we need another pipeline, let's build it in the most cost-effective way and the politically least controversial way. And that would mean taking it maybe through the Baltic states and across Poland to Germany. If we need another pipeline, that's the obvious thing to do. And that creates a lot more stakeholders, and it broadens the political base, and nobody could complain about it. Now, I actually think that Europe should not be getting more than 30% of its gas from Russia anyway, and that was the promise that Europe made to itself back in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was warning the Europeans about becoming too dependent on Soviet gas. And the Europeans said, okay, we'll never take more than 30% because we'll never be that vulnerable. That's been long forgotten. Now, okay, we are now much more dependent on Russian gas. We should make sure we do it in a way that minimises the political risk, and that means not having bilateral pipelines just between two countries. And it also means that we should be trying to diversify. So I think if we had to build this extra northern pipeline, we should have said to the Russians, okay, we'll build it, but it must be demonopolised, so common carrier, and we also were going to build Nabucco as well. And we as Europe could say that because we are 3 times bigger